how do you work? Do you work like in certain times of the day, every day? Do you have rules? How do you actually physically write a novel like this?
I try not to. Look, there are. In fact, I explore in the book. Ernest Hemingway's in the book. Ernest Hemingway's I'll talk about that in a minute too. Ernest Hemingway's in the book, and when Errol's struggling to write his script for this crap movie, he decides to go and see Ernest Hemingway for a bit of inspiration. And Hemingway was renowned for having a certain discipline. He used to write 500 words a day, no matter what. Minimum 500 words every day. And then he'd go out and get drunk. And then he'd wake up in the morning with a hangover and write 500 words. Standing up, never sitting down, always at a typewriter, etc., etc. So even when he wasn't working on a book, he would write that. I don't have that discipline, and I don't think I need that discipline, because if I had to write 500 words every day, 2 out of 3 of those 500 words wouldn't be worth reading. But I work every day, but I don't write every day. You know, if I'm not writing, I'm researching or I'm editing, and I don't write until I really know what I'm going to write and how. And it's like when the inspiration hits you, you write. If the inspiration is not there, it's not worth writing.
Did you write it chronologically?
I did, yeah. In fact, I wrote this. The first thing I did was write a synopsis, and the synopsis was based on the taking the dates, which is why every chapter of the book carries a date. And the dates are true. I took the days, from the time when Errol would get involved until Errol dies, essentially, and picked dates through those times. And I followed the progress of the Cuban Revolution, because although the Cuban Revolution went on for about 5 years, it all happened in about the last two months. And they happened to be the 2 months when he was down there. Before that, it was almost a stalemate. I mean, there's a bunch of bearded men up in the hills, and there weren't very many of them. Even when I talk about, I can't remember the name of the writer. The New York Times published a story on him, on Fidel Castro, Matthews. Anyway, he published a front page story on Fidel Castro, and he said he had about 300 men in the jungle, in the Sierra. But in fact, as it's since been shown, Fidel had maybe 20 men. And the way he convinced the New York Times journalist that he had more, he had the same men marching through the camp, backwards and forwards, disappearing into the jungle and going around and then coming back again. And so Matthews was convinced that that he had hundreds of men, but in fact he had about 20.
Yeah. So when you do this research, how do you actually then capture the research? Do you just copy and paste it into a document, or how do you?
Well, in this particular case, it's not the case with everything, but because I had the facts of the Cuban Revolution to provide a backbone for the entire work, I then worked out. Originally, I was going to have everything. Each chapter was going to be 1 day, but that was too restrictive. But I still had the dates, so I took each date and made each date a chapter, which ended up with, and I had about 30 dates, made it about 30 chapters, and because each of those days had an incident. I then, all the information I had on that particular day, I kept in folders and then went through the folders, and I wrote it chronologically.
Yeah. So tell us about Ernest Hemingway and the story there.
Yeah, well, I had a situation where I wanted Errol to be struggling to write this script, because he did write the script. Call it a script, I suppose. He did write it, and so I got him struggling with it, not knowing where, because he did write a couple of books. He wrote 2 novels. He also wrote, he wrote with a ghostwriter his memoirs that came out just after he died. He was no slouch as a writer. He was pretty good, but he'd never written a screenplay before, and he was also, by this stage, he was only 12 months before he died, and he was wasted. So so I wanted him to find inspiration somewhere. So where would you go if you're living in Cuba? Where would you go? You look up Ernest Hemingway. He lived there at the time. So all I knew was that Errol Flynn spent a lot of time in Cuba. Ernest Hemingway lived in Cuba at this time. So I then, it's not hard to research this. I found out what bars Ernest Hemingway went to, what time of day he went there, what he drank when he went there, and because it was part of his regular routine. He went to one bar to drink daiquiris and another bar to drink mojitos. So I got him in his daiquiri bar called the Floridita, and Errol goes and finds him there. So I wrote a chapter with Errol and Ernest Hemingway having a chat. And of course, Ernest Hemingway was known to look down on actors. So it was, once again, it was conflict. So I wrote the chapter. Sometime later, I found a... specifically for this reason.
Good.
I found a...
Show and tell.
Yeah. Bearing in mind that this was completely fabricated, I found a photograph after I'd written the chapter which has Errol Flynn and Ernest Hemingway at the bar in the Floridita in the clothes that I described with the drinks that I described. I don't describe Errol's clothes, but I do describe Ernest Hemingway's clothes. Now, okay, he often wore white. But, I mean,
How did you find that picture, for example?
on the net. I was researching something else, and
So accidentally.
accidentally I found this photograph. Oh. And it made the hair on the neck stand up. There was another incident where one of the final chapters where Fidel, the first time Fidel goes to New York after the revolution, and Errol goes to his hotel to try and make up with him. And so I researched what hotel Fidel stayed at. It was a hotel called the Statler Hilton, and I wrote that entire scene in the lobby of in the lobby bar of the Statler Hilton. A couple of months later, I was going to New York, and I had the travel agent, not for this purpose, strictly a holiday, and I had the travel agent said he'd find a hotel for me. He sent me through by email. He sent me through. He said, "I found a hotel. What about this one?" And it was the Hotel Pennsylvania, which was the Statler Hilton. And it's got to be the worst hotel in New York. It's the biggest hotel in New York, and it's absolute rubbish. But I had to stay there. We had to stay there because,
Of course. So, all of these things, these three things that you've told us about, were there more?
oh, it happened. Look, last night there was a documentary. I don't know if anyone saw it on Foxtel called The Adventures of Errol Flynn. That was last night. Today, on Turner Classic Movies, their movie of the day is The Adventures of Don Juan. This is happening all the time. All the time.
Are you a kind of superstitious guy?
Well, I wasn't before this. but I wanted to know, I wanted to have a, like for instance, I want to have a piece of dialogue I would want Errol to be saying, and I wanted to use some dialogue out of a film. And that film would be on the next day on TCM. I mean, if you watch TCM, his films come up, I don't know, once every 3 months.
Yeah.
But they were on all the time when I was writing this.
So you think maybe Errol's playing games?
Well, he dictated the book.
That's right. That's right.
I didn't. Writing this from beyond the grave is a bit of a high wire act because, well, for obvious reasons. I always use Sunset Boulevard as a reason why it's possible.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in one respect, you have the comfort of knowing that he's dead, or at least dead physically anyway. So nobody's going to sue you, and nobody's going to argue with what he said and how he said it. On the other hand, you're writing for the readers, and readers can very quickly pick up phony in a book. And I haven't picked up any phony in the book. I mean, it's just, you've got this wonderful picture of this larrikin from Tasmania. He's the only person in his circle who knows where Tasmania is. But he's a typical Aussie larrikin with a great sense of humour, and it's the kind of humour that Australians will instantly understand and want to. And he's also He's self-aware. He knows his weaknesses, which is one of the things that comes through beautifully in the book. And because the other thing is that you can't stop reading it because it's so entertaining. Were you entertained writing it as much as we are reading it?
Well, the way the dialogue would happen, and yes, I would find myself laughing when the dialogue happened.
Yeah. You were the first audience.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And what you say about the larrikin nature is the thing about Errol Flynn was that the people who've written about him in the past have all been Americans. Well, I think an Englishman wrote a biography of him, but I don't think that anyone has really understood him. For a start, Australians most Australians don't know he's Australian. It's only in the last maybe 10 years, not even that, when it's become more common knowledge. Certainly in America, they got no idea where he comes from, because when he arrived in Hollywood, he was promoted as an Irishman, because no one knew where Australia was. It was all too hard to explain, so they made him an Irishman. And he didn't. He went along with the game, as he did with all the publicity. But later on, they would write, when they wrote about him, they would say he was from Tasmania, an island to the south of Australia. They didn't even know where or what Tasmania was. So it was someplace in the South Seas, And when they talk about him being a singular character, and when Americans talk about him being a singular character, he was not singular in Australia. He just had a lot more money, and he had a lot more daring than most, but he was your typical Australian larrikin. He used to play games and pranks on set all the time. If Crocodile Dundee had grown up in the city, he'd be more like Errol Flynn.
To what extent did you discover things? Obviously, you discovered lots of things in your research, but to what extent were some of those things surprising to you, and which would be surprising to the readers about him?
I don't think I got any surprises with Errol. There's not that much that's been written about him. I suppose I got more surprises with Fidel. Before the revolution, just what a vulnerable character he was. It was all bluff and bluster, but he changed remarkably and markedly when as soon as the Havana fell. And that you've got to understand, Havana fell without any warning. I mean, Batista. If you've seen The Godfather, you know what happened in Godfather, where they're having a New Year's Eve party, and he says, "I'm off," and off he goes. And it's true. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Che Guevara won a battle in Santa Clara, which was not exactly a pivotal battle, and Batista said, "It's all too hard, off I go," and took the money with him.